Hello everyone and welcome to the Butterfly Princess Academy where curiosity takes flight and wisdom wears wings. In today's lesson we're going to be discussing Victorian medicine. So this lesson is going to be split in two parts. Part one, I'm going to be telling you about Victorian medicine, and part two of the lesson, I'm going to be telling you about common illnesses of the Victorian era and the treatments that we use to help cure and prevent them. So here goes. So part one, Victorian medicine bridging superstition and science in the age of transformation. Introduction. In the Victorian era between 1837 and 1901, marked by Queen Victoria's reign and rapid industrialisation, witnessed a seismic shift in medical practices. This period bridged ancient superstitions and modern scientific rigour, laying the foundations for contemporary healthcare, from the horrors of pre-anaesthetic surgery to groundbreaking public health reforms. Victorian medicine was a battleground of innovation, inequality and cultural change. Historical context from homes to hospitals. The Victorian era coincided with industrialisation, which fueled urbanisation and overcrowding. Cities like London became breeding grounds for disease, forcing medicine to evolve from a trade rooted in traditions to a profession guided by science. Before 1837, humoral theory dominated European medicine. Physicians believed illnesses stemmed from imbalances in four bodily fluids: blood, plasma, black bile and yellow bile. Treatments like bloodletting and purging aim to restore balance, often worsening patients' conditions. By contrast, Victorian interventions such as germ theory and antiseptics began prioritising ethnical evidence over tradition. Germ theory versus miasma. The 1861 publication of Louis Pasteur's germ theory disproved widespread belief in miasma, disease caused by bad air. Joseph Lister applied this science, introducing carbolic acid antiseptic sprays. In 1867, which slashed surgical mortality rates from 45% to 15%. Anesthetic ether 1846 and chloroform 1847 transformed surgery, while chloroforms used during Queen Victoria's 1853 childbirth legitimised it. Religious groups declared anaesthesia as unnatural, arguing pain was divine punishment. Assumptions remained in common, but pioneers like Harold Gillies, later a World War I plastic surgeon, built on Victorian experiments in reconstructive surgeries. Laudanum, opium, eased pain but caused widespread addiction. Mercury treated syphilis but often poisoned patients. Quinine derived from bark became a lifeline against malaria. Institution and professionalism built right. Hospitals and training Charitable hospitals like London St Bartholomew's evolved into training centres, sterilising surgical and diagnostic practices. The 1858 Medical Act established the General Medical Council, which is still in use today, otherwise shortened to the GMC, ending unregulated practitioners by requiring formal qualifications. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson defined gender norms, earning her medical licence in 1865. Sophia Jacques Blake led the Edinburgh Seven in 1869, fighting for women's admissions to medical schools despite violent protests. John Snow's 1854 cholera map linked outbreaks to contaminated water, debunking miasma theory. Edwin Chadwick's 1842 sanitary report spurred this 1875 Public Health Act, mandating clean water and sewage systems. The 1853 compulsory smallpox vaccination act saved countless lives, but sparked one of history's first anti-vaccination movements, and we've seen that a lot throughout history, like for example in our times when people don't like to vaccinate the children, so that means that the cases of MMR, measles, mumps and rubella and other childhood illnesses are on the rise. For example, another example would be the COVID vaccination. When that came about, some people were against that as well. But sparked one of history's first anti-vaccination movements, fueled by distrust of government overreach. Wealthy Victorians lived to 45 on average, while slum dwellers often died by 22 due to malnutrition, pollution and inadequate care. Class divide. The wealthy act as private physicians, while the poor relied on overcrowded workhouse infirmaries where survival rates were grim. Unregulated patient medicine like Dr. James's fever powder promised miracle cures. Advertisements preyed on desperation, selling opium-laced tonics as cures. Asylums adopted moral treatment, therapy and fresh air, but overcrowding under the 1860 Lunacy Act led to neglect and abuse. Microscopes enabled Rudolph cellular pathology linking disease to cellular change. The stethoscope became a symbol of clinical precision. Florence Nightingale's Crimea War mortality chart, 1850s, proved sanitation reduced deaths, pioneering evidence-based medicine. Surgeons like James Timson tested chloroform on themselves, raising questions about consent and risk. Charles Dickens' Bleak House depicted smallpox outbreaks, highlighting public health failures. Arthur Conan Doyle, who is the creator of Sherlock Holmes, was also a physician, wove medical logic into his Sherlock Holmes detective work. The Lancet, founded in 1823, shaped medical discourse, publishing breakthroughs like whiskers, antiseptics. Conclusion: Victorian medicine was a paradox. It birthed modern healthcare through germ theory, anaesthesia, and public health reforms, yet perpetrated inequality and quackery. As Florence Nightingale wrote in her Notes on Nursing, published in 1859, the very first requirement in a hospital is that it should do the sick no harm. This year, that has gone out of the window now, hasn't it? Because most people nowadays dread going into hospital for long periods of time, don't they? Because when you go into hospital, even if you're just going for a routine outpatient appointment, you risk, catching, the cold and other things, MRSA and things. So, that theory of the quote from Florence Nightingale's book of 1859, the very first requirement in a hospital is that it should do the sick no harm, has completely gone out the window by our modern standards today. This era's triumphs and failures remind us that progress is often fraught with struggle, but its legacy endures in every sterile scalpel and vaccination campaign. Right, now, analysis now. Victorian medicine bridging superstition and science in the age of transformation. This part of the lesson offers a comprehensive exploration of Victorian medicine, weaving together scientific progress, social challenges, and cultural shifts. So here goes. Historical perspectives from traditional to modernity, key strengths. Industrialisation is catalyst, but the discussion effectively links industrialisation to medical interventions, urban overcrowding and epidemics, e.g. cholera outbreak, forced to reckoning with outdated practices like humoral theory, paving the way for germ theory and sanitation reforms. Landmark discoveries. The focus on Pasteur's 1861 germ theory and Lister's antiseptics highlights how epidemical science replaced superstition. The staggering drop in surgical mortality rate from 45% to 15%. Now that is a big reduction from 45 to 15%. That is a 30% reduction in death rates resulting from surgical procedures. Underscores the practical impact of these breakthroughs. Legislation and professionalism. The 1858 Medical Act and the rise of hospitals as training hubs illustrates institutionalised shifts that professionalise medicine, marginalising crack practitioners. Right, so here goes. Last step, the discussion starkly contrasts the life expectancy of the wealthy. They lived on average to the age of 45, and the poor lived on average to the age of 22, reflecting on how medicine served as a tool of social stratification, private physicians versus workhouse infirmaries to exemplify Victorian England's rigid class hierarchy. The struggles of Elizabeth Garrett Anderson and the Edinburgh Seven reveal cultural resistance to women in medicine. Their exclusions from institutions like the British Medical Association until 1892 mirrors broader social misogyny. Religion versus science, opposition to antiseptic, seen as defying divine will, and anti-vaccination movements reveal tensions between tradition and modernality. These debates mirror today's distrust of scientific authority, cultural nuisance, mental health stigma. The discussion touches on asylum abuses. Right, and I'm going to go into consumer culture. Patent medicines like Dr. James's fever powder reflect the rise of consumerism and advertising power to exploit public fear. Right. John Snow's an epidemiologist. Snow's cholera map is presented as a watershed moment demonstrating data-driven policy making. His work challenged miasma theory, yet adoption was slow, illustrating institutional sanitation reforms. Edwin Chadwick's advocacy for clean water and sewage systems codified in the 1875 Public Health Act is framed as a triumph of collective responsibility and individualism. Vaccination resistance. This essay, this discussion notes anti-vaccine settlement. Yeah. So here goes. I've read that. In fact, so here are 20 thought-provoking questions related to Victorian medicine, and I'll read out the questions and then provide the answers. So question 1, analytical. How did industrialisation directly categorise the transition from humoral theory to evidence-based medicine in Victorian Britain? Question 2, comparison. Contrast the effectiveness of miasma theory and germ theory in addressing cholera outbreaks. Why did germ theory face resistance despite its epidemial basis? What role did urbanization play in exacerbating public health crisis, and how did this force medical reform? Was the widespread use of mercury for syphilis treatment justified given the toxic side effects? Defend your position using Victorian social values. How did anaesthesia transform surgery not just medically but culturally? For example, religious backlash, patient trust. In what ways did the Victorian opioid crisis, laudanum addiction, foreshadow modern pharmaceutical challenges? Why was the 1858 Medical Act a turning point in distinguishing legitimate physicians from cracks? How did Elizabeth Garrett's career reflect both progress and boundaries for women in Victorian medicine? If the Edinburgh Seven had not campaigned for women's medical education, how might this have delayed healthcare reforms? How did John Snow's cholera map exemplify the rise of data as a tool for public health policy? How are Victorian anti-vaccination movements similar to modern vaccine hysteria considered distrust of authority and misinformation? Were Edwin Chadwick's sanitation reforms more motivated by humanisation concerns or economic productivity? Use evidence from the essay. How did Victorian healthcare perpetuate class divides, and what parallels exist today? To what extent did British resilience on colonial resources, for example, shape medical progress? Why were unethical practices like self-experimentation, chloroform trials, socially accepted in Victorian medicine? How did Charles Dickens use disease in Bleak House to critique Victorian social failures? In what ways did the Lancets documentise medical knowledge while reinforcing elitism? Which Victorian intervention, e.g. anaesthetics, data-driven care, has had the most enduring impact on modern medicines? How did Florence Nightingale's emphasis on sanitation preferred the World Health Organization's public health priorities? Can Victorian medicine be considered a success if its achievements coexisted with exploitation and inequality? So these are the answers. So question 1. Industrialisation caused rapid urbanisation, leading to overcrowded cities and disease outbreaks, for example, cholera. Traditional humoral theory failed to address these crises, pushing demand for evidence-based solutions like germ theory and sanitation reforms. Factories required healthier workers, accelerating medical professionalisation. Question 2. Miasma theory focused on bad air leading to ineffective measures like ventilation. Germ theory linked diseases to microbes, prompting sanitation improvements, for example, John Snow's cholera map. Resistance challenged entrenched beliefs and required cross-lit infrastructure changes facing institutionalised inferior. Question 3. Urbanisation caused slums with poor sanitation spreading diseases. This forced reforms like the 1875 Public Health Act, mandating clean water and sewage systems, driven by necessity rather than tradition. Medical advancements. Question 4. Mercury's use for syphilis reflected Victorian prioritization of disease control over toxicity. Moral stigma around syphilis justified harsh treatments, aligning with social values of moral and physical purification. Question 5. Anesthetics, for example, chloroform, reduce surgical pain, increasing survival rates. Culturally, it forced religious opposition but gained acceptance after Queen Victoria's use, shifting public trust towards medical science. Question 6. Laudanum's widespread addiction mirrors modern opioid crisis. Overprescriptions, profit-driven patient medicine, and poor understanding of addiction risk. Question 7. The 1858 Medical Act established the General Medical Council, requiring formal qualifications. This ended unregulated quackery and standardized medical training. Question 8. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson's 1865 licence marked progress, but systematic barriers persisted. For example, the Edinburgh 7 forced violent protests. Women remained marginalised in medical institutions. Question 9. Without the Edinburgh 7, women's entry into medicine would have been delayed, prolonging gender in healthcare intervention and public care. Question 10. John Snow's data-driven cholera map identified contaminated water sources, proving the power of epidemiological evidence in policy making. For example, the closing of the Broad Street pump. Question 11. Both movements stem from distrust of authority. For example, the 1853 Vaccination Act versus COVID-19 mandates, and misinformation spread through pamphlets in social media. Question 12. Chadwick's reforms prioritised economic productivity, healthy workers boosting industrial output, though humanitarian benefits were a secondary outcome. Question 13. Wealthy Victorians accessed private care, the poor endured workhouse infirmaries. Modern parallels include socio-economic disparities in healthcare access. Question 14. Colonial exploitation, for example, South African bark for cricket, enabled malaria treatments, supporting imperial expansion while exploiting indigenous resources. 15. Self-experimentation, for example, James Simpson's chloroform trials, was justified by the era's lack of ethnical guidelines and the glorification of scientific progress. Question 16. Dickens' Bleak House used smallpox to critique public health neglect and social indifferences towards the poor. Question 17. The Lancet shared breakthroughs, for example, Lister's antiseptics, but catered to educated elites, excluding the lower classes. Question 18. Germ theory and antiseptics remain foundational, reducing infections and revolutionising surgery. Question 19. Nightingale sanitation focus and data use founded World Health Organization's emphasis on preventative care and evidence-based practices. Question 20. Victorian medicine was a paradox, groundbreaking advantage. Germ theory, aesthesia coexisted with exploitation, colonial class, gender. Success is measured by progress, yet mirrored by inquiry. One minute. Yeah, just some I'll now provide you some rhetorical questions that provoke thought and reflection, and then I will read you the questions out, and then I will read you some insights. So, question 1. Right, so here goes. Can we truly celebrate the advent of germ theory when so many clung to the comforts of miasma, their fears as thick as London smog? Was the relief of surgical pain a defiance of divine will or moral obligation of progress? How many lives in London slums were deemed expendable to uphold the illusion of Victorian progress? Would John Snow's cholera map have sparked change without the stark, unflinching numbers that shamed the society into action? Did the stethoscope around the wealthy physician's neck amplify the crisis of the poor or drown them out? Could the Edinburgh Seven struggle for education ever be separated from the broader fight of women's autonomy in a society that confined them to the home? When surgeons like James Simpson inhaled chloroform to test its safety, were they pioneers of progress or gamblers with their lives? Does the clinic that saved British soldiers in India carry the silent screams of colonialised lands stripped of their resources? Were asylums meant to heal the mind or to hide away the undesirables? A prosperous empire refused to see. How different are the pamphlets of the 19th century anti-vaccinations from the social media posts that spread out today? Can we condemn Victorian crap remedies while our own shelves grow under the weight of miracle cures needed for profit? Was Florence Nightingale's a lamp a beacon of compassion or a spotlight, exposing how little the empire cared for its most vulnerable? Does the stethoscope hanging around every modern doctor's neck carry the echoes of Victorian elitism or the promise of scientific rigour? Can we separate the brilliance of Lister's antiseptics from the colonial violence that funded the empire's medical enlightenment? So here are some insights. Question 1. Germ theory versus miasma. Germ theory versus miasma. Celebrating germ theory requires acknowledging the social interior that clung to miasma. Progress often demands dismantling erotic beliefs, even when evidence is clear. Resistance to germ theory underscores the tension between imperial science and cultural comfort. Antiseptics' moral dilemma. The religious backlash against aesthesia reveals a fear of usurping divine authority. Yet its adoption after Queen Victoria's endorsement illustrates how authoritative figures can legitimise scientific progress, balancing intervention with social acceptance. Expandable lives. The poor in slums were casualties of urbanization, unchecked growth. Their suffering exposed systematic indifferences, forcing reforms like Chadwick's sanitation laws, a reminder that progress often follows tragedy. John Snow's cholera map was revolutionary because it transformed abstract suffering into irrefutable data. Without this evidence, public health policy might have remained stagnant, highlighting the power of data to shame societies into action. The stethoscope epitomised medical elitism, gatekeeping care for the wealthy. It's used distracting physicians from the poor who relied on overcrowded infirmaries, a reflection of healthcare's enduring class divide. Edinburgh 7, their fight transcended education. It challenged political norms that confined women to domestic roles. Their exclusion from institutions like the British Medical Association until 1892 mirrors broader social resistance to gender equality. Self-experimentation. Surgeons like Simpson embodied the era's ends justify means ethos. Their risk-taking advanced medicine but ignored ethnical boundaries, foreshadowing modern debates over consent in clinical trials. Colonial exploitation. British success against malaria was built on colonial extraction of cinnamon bark, erasing indigenous knowledge and labour. This underscores how imperial violence funded Europe's medical enlightenment. Asylums as warehouses. Asylums claim to heal but often serve to isolate society's undesirables, reflecting Victorian anxieties about mental health and social order. This legacy lingers in modern stigmatisation of mental illness. Although I don't suppose that is improving now because there's a lot of discussion and dialogue, isn't there, nowadays around mental health and things. Anti-vaccine parallels. Both that Victorian pamphlets and modern misinformation exploited distrust of authority. The 1853 Vaccination Act and COVID-19 mandates reveal cynical resistance to state-imposed measures. Illusions of care, crap remedies versus modern cures. Victorian patient medicines in today's wellness fads both commodify hope targeting vulnerability for profit. This underscores capitalism's role. Florence Nightingale's lamp. Her work highlighted systematic neglect, while her reforms saved lives. They also exposed the limits of individual heroism in addressing structural inequalities. Stethoscope's dual legacy. It symbolises scientific rigour but also the elitism of a profession that excluding marginalised voices. Modern medicine must confront the history to democratise care. Whiskers antiseptics and colonialism interventions like antiseptics advanced surgery but were funded by imperial exploitation. Acknowledging this complicates their legacy, urging us to weigh progress against its moral costs. Final thoughts, the duality of progress. The Victorian medical landscape was crucible of contradictions, a time where science triumphed over superstition, yet progress was built on exploitation, when anesthesia is suffering, yet opium addiction that revenge lives when public health reforms save millions, yet the poor remain expandable. This duality reminds us that progress is never a linear ascent, but a fraught negotiation between intervention and ethics, ambitions and humanity. The era's legacy is not merely a catalogue of breakthroughs, germ theory, antiseptics, epidemiology, but a mirror reflecting our own struggles. How do we balance technological advancements with equality? How do we honour the marginalised voices erased from history? The Victorians' triumphs and failures urge us to confront these questions with humanity and resolve. And just to finish, I've come up with some inspirational sort of quotes to carry forward and for you to think about. So here goes. A quote from Florence Nightingale. I attribute my success to this. I never gave or took an excuse. Carry this. Progress demands relentless accountability to science, to society, and to those left behind. Joseph Lister. The true values of discoveries lies not in their brilliance, but in their application for the good of all. Carry this. Innovation must serve humanity, not just the powerful. Charles Dickens via Bleak House. Get your majesty, get my lords and gentlemen, get right reverends and wrong reverends of every order. Get born into this world, dead. Carry this. Art and gaze to light can expose social neglect. Use both to fight injustice. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson. I forged a path where there was none, not for glory, but so others might follow. Carry this. Bleak barriers not for acclaim, but to dismantle them for good. Jon Snow. Facts like water will always find their level. Carry this. Truth persists even when buried by dogma. Seek it, share it, act on it. Nelson Mandela echoing Victorian lessons. What counts in life is not the mere fact that we have lived it. It is what difference we have made to the lives of others. Carry this. Let progress be measured not by paintings or papers, but by lives uplifted. A call to heal. The Victorians taught us that medicine is more than scalpels and syringes. It is a moral practice. As we stand on the shadows of their breakthroughs, let us also learn from the blindness. May we wield science with compassion, champion equality fiercely as intervention, and remember that every sterile instrument, every vaccine, every hospital bed carries the weight of history and the promise of a healthier, more just future. Go forth and heal. So that concludes the first part of the lesson. Part 2 of the lesson. Common illnesses and their treatments during the Victorian era. The Victorian era between 1837 and 1901 was a period of profound social, industrial and scientific transformation. However, medical knowledge and practices lagged behind these advancements, creating a paradoxical landscape where groundbreaking discoveries coexisted with an often harmful treatments. This lesson explores the most prevalent illnesses of the era, the theories underpinning their treatment and the gradual shift towards modern medical practices that emerged in the 19th century. Medical theories and practices, foundations of Victorian medicine. Victorian medicine was rooted in a blend of ancient doctrines and emerging scientific inquiry. The humoral theory inherited from Hippocraticus and Glen remained influential, posting that health depended on balancing the flow of bodily fluids, blood, fat, plasma, black bile and yellow bile. Imbalances were treated through bloodletting, purging or blistering practices that persisted despite growing scepticism. Equally dominant was the miasma theory, which attributed disease to bad air emanating from decomposing organic matter. This belief shaped public health policies, emphasising sanitation improvements like sewer systems and waste removal. However, the theories focused on environmental factors overlooked the role of pathogens, delaying the adoption of germ theory until the 1870s. Medical practitioners ranged from university-trained physicians who catered to the wealthy to apothecaries and cracks, pending dubious remedies. The era also saw the rise of ancient medicines, opioid-laced tonics, advertised as cure all, but often exuberating addiction or illnesses. Common illnesses and their treatments. Number 1, cholera. Symptoms included severe diarrhea, vomiting, dehydration, and rapid death. Cholera epidemics devastated Victorian cities, fueled by overcrowding and contaminated waters. The disease's cure remained misunderstood until John Snow linked an 1854 lunging outbreak to a contaminated water pump, challenging miasma theory. Treatments for cholera included bloodletting and camel. Physicians administered mercury-based camel to purge the bowels, worsening dehydration. Opium, used to suppress dehydration, often hindering death by masking symptoms. Rehydration. Mandatory doctors advocated for saline solution, progressing modern oral rehydration therapy. Tuberculosis, what is known now as TB, and what was known in the Victorian era as consumption. Symptoms included chronic cough, weight loss, fever, and bloody spectrums, coughing up blood. TB was as a wasting disease of poets and artists, accounted for 25% of urban deaths. The bucus causing TB was identified in 1882, but effective treatments remained elusive. Treatments, climate curse. Patients were sent to seaside or mountainous regions for fresh air. Cod liver oil and laudanum used to evaluate symptoms. The latter risked opium addiction. Sanitariums. Emerging in the late 1800s, these facilities isolated patients and promoted rest. The outcomes were poor. Typhoid fever. Symptoms included high fever, abdominal pain, rash, and diarrhea. Typhoid spread via contaminated food and water, claimed lives across all classes, including Prince Albert, who died of this disease of typhoid fever in 1861. And it's true to say that Queen Victoria never fully recovered from his death. She became very distant from her people, and she can from 1861 towards the end of her reign and her death in 1901. She wore black, which was of course the colour of mourning. Treatments for typhoid fever included cold baths to reduce fever, often including shock, branding stimulants administered to sustain strength. Malaria treatment misapplied to typhoid with limited success. Smallpox symptoms included fever, a rash, and scarring. Smallpox remained a scourge despite the introduction of vaccines by Edward Jenner in 1796. Vaccine skepticism and incoherent access left the poor vulnerable. Treatments included ravaged infection with mild smallpox strains, but this was phased out post-vaccine. Isolation. In fact, infected individuals were quarantined in packed hospitals, and that sort of brings us back to the COVID-19 pandemic, doesn't it? In the early days, before we all went into lockdown and stuff, if you you had COVID-19, you were advised to remain indoors and away from people. And during the lockdown, although the people who were telling us that we should go into lockdown didn't practice social distancing, members of the public were told to social distance or they would face a fine, which just proves that the government was a bunch of hypocrites because they didn't abide by their own rules. But by the by on that, scarlet fever symptoms included sore throat, rash, and high mortality rate among children. Outbreaks were linked to staphylococcus bacteria, though this was unknown at the time. Treatments for scarlet scarlet fever included belladonna derived from deadly nightshade used to reduce inflammation, leeches applied to the throat to the throat to balance humours. And leeches, it's often worth noting that leeches were often used in ancient Egypt as well. Whenever anyone had a sore on their bodies or whatever from the battlefield, leeches would be applied to the affected area, where they would then suck out all the badness from the injury and then fall off when they had removed all that badness, and then that's how the affected area would heal. Childbed fever. Symptoms included postpartum infection causing fever, sepsis, and death. Ignis was ranked at 1847 discovery that hand washing reduced infections were ignored for decades, as doctors resisted the idea that they transmitted disease. Treatments for childbed fever included bleeding and purging, standard intervention that weakened patients, herbal applied to severe abdomen with little effect, surgery and pain management. Surgery in the early Victorian era was a last resort due to the risk of infection and pain. Assumptions were performed swiftly, often without anesthesia. Amputations were performed swiftly, often without anaesthesia, which became widely available only after the 1840s with the use of either ether or chloroform. Post-operative infections were rampant until Joseph Lister pioneered antiseptic surgery in the 1860s, using carbolic acid to sterilise instruments in wounds. The rise of preventive medicine and public health. The last half of the era saw progress. Germ theory. Louis Pasteur's work in microbes, 1860s, and Robert Koch's identification of pathogens, also in the 1860s, revolutionised understanding. Victorian Vaccination Acts made smallpox vaccinations compulsory for infants by 1853. Public Health Acts of 1875 mandated clean water sewage systems and slum cleanliness, reducing waterborne diseases. Legacy of Victorian medicine. The Victorian-era laid the groundwork for modern medicine built through trial and error, while harmful practices like mercury use and bloodletting faded. The period's emphasis on sanitation, vaccine and germ theory reshaped public health. Florence Nightingale's nursing reforms and the professionalisation of medicine via the Medical Act of 1858, which established regular standards, further condemned its fate legacy. In conclusion, Victorian medicine was a battleground of tradition and invention, suffering from limited scientific rigour. It nevertheless showed the seeds of evidence-based practice, reminding us that medical progress is often a slow, intricate journey marked by both treachery and triumph. So that is my sort of lecture on Victorian illnesses and how they were treated. Now I'm going to give a detailed analysis of this lecture by giving, as well as including historical and cultural narratives. The Victorian era witnessed staggeringly high mortality rates, particularly among the urban poor, due to overcrowding, poor sanitation and limited medical knowledge. Key statistics and trends include cholera. Mortality rates during outbreaks reached between 40 and 60%, with the 1849 to 1849 epidemic claiming over 53,000 lives in England and Wales. John Snow's 1854 Broad Street pump study revealed that cholera deaths clustered around contaminated water sources, yet miasma theory persisted for decades. TB, the leading cause of death in the 19th century, responsible for 1/3 of all working-class urban deaths. Mortality rates declined only marginally by 1900, from 3,000 to 2,000 per million, as effective treatments remained absent. Typhoid mortality rates hovered around 10 to 20%, though higher among malnourished populations. Prince Albert's death from typhoid in 1861 underscored the reach. Smallpox vaccination reduced deaths by 80% by 1850, yet outbreaks persisted in impoverished areas. The 1871 epidemic killed 23,000 Britons, primarily unvaccinated children. Infant and maternal mortality roughly between 150 and 200 infants per 1,000 births died before the age of 1. Maternal mortality from childbed fever range between 5 to 10%, peaking in hospitals where doctors resisted antiseptic practices. These figures highlight the era's epidemiological crisis driven by urbanization, individualism, urbanization, and the lag between scientific discovery and practical application. Historical context. Victorian medicine was shaped by competing paradigms and incremental advancements. Pre-germ theory practices. Until the 1870s, miasma and humoral theories dominated. Treatments like bloodletting, for example, George Washington's death in 1799 from excessive mercury-based worsening outcomes. For example, cholera patients subjected to purging faced dehydration rates exceeding 1 litre of fluid loss per hour. Breakthrough in resistance. Antiseptic. Joseph Lister's 1865 uses of carbolic acids reduced surgical infections from 50 to 15%, yet many surgeons dismissed his methods as unnecessary. Vaccination. Edward Jenner's smallpox vaccine of 1796 faced public distrust. Anti-vaccine leads cited religious objections, interfering with God's will and safety concerns. Anesthesia, 1846, and chloroform, 1847. Transformed surgery, but their use in childbirth was controversial. Religious figures like Reverend Charles Kingsley argued pain during labour was divine punishment for Eve's sin. Public health reforms. The 1848 Public Health Act and 1875 sanitary law reduced mortality from waterborne diseases by mandating clean water and sewage systems. Life expectancy in London rose from 37 years to in 1841 to 45 years by 1901. Nowadays people live a lot longer. People are living to a ripe old age these days. But in the Victorian era, Victorian life expectancy wasn't as long as it is today. Victorian attitudes towards illness reflected deep-seated cultural norms, religious beliefs, and class divisions. Romanticization of disease. Tuberculosis was mythologized as the artist's disease, linked to heightened creativity and supernatural purity. This symbolization populated by poets like John Keats obscured its brutal reality as a poverty-driven killer. Mortality and blame illness was often moralized. Syphilis, for instance, was deemed a sinful disease, while poverty-related ailments like rickets were attributed to laziness rather than malnutrition. The wealthy accessed private physicians and spa treatments, while the poor relied on overcrowded hospitals, patient medicines, or folk remedies, for example, garlic for worms. Workhouse infirmaries became de facto hospitals for destitute, with mortality rates 2 to 3 times higher than private facilities due to neglect and unsanitary traditions. Gender roles. Women's health was narrowly focused on reproduction. Childbed fever deaths were blamed for female weakness, ignoring causes. Florence Nightingale's nursing reforms of the 1850s challenged gendered assumptions by professionalising care as women's work. Crackling consumer culture. The rise of mass media embodied patent magazines vendors to exploit public desperation. Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound marketed for female complaints contained 20% alcohol, while cocaine-laced tonics promised energy vitality. The Victorian-era laid the foundations for evidence-based medicines, but also exposed systematic failures. Scientific advancements. Louis Pasteur's germ theory, 1861, and Robert Koch's discovery of the tuberculosis of 1882 shifted focus on pathogens. Both the vaccine for typhoid of 1896 and TB 1921 came later. Ethnical shifts. The 1858 Medical Act established licensing standards, marginalising cracks. However, unethical practices persisted, such as body snatching for autonomy skills or non-consensual experimentations on the poor. Social reforms. Public health campaigns driven by reformers like Edward Chadwick framed sanitation as a moral duty, linking cleanliness to a national strength. This ethos influenced later movements, including eugenics. So here are some questions in relation to this essay, to this lesson. So, how did the humoral theory and miasma theory shape Victorian approaches to disease prevention and treatments? What were the limitations of these theories? Why was cholera particularly devastating in urban areas during the Victorian era? How did John Snow's work challenging prevailing medical beliefs? In what ways did class discrepancies influence access to medical care and outcomes for diseases like tuberculosis or smallpox? When did TB become romanticised in Victorian culture, and how did the perception conflict with its realities of poverty-driven disease? How did the lack of understanding about germ theory contribute to the spread of infections in hospitals, particularly in cases of childbed fever? How did Victorian gender roles influence the treatments of women's health issues such as childbed fever or hysteria? Why were patent medicines and crap remedies so popular despite their dangers? What does this reveal about public trust in formal medicine? How did religious or moral beliefs, for example, pain during childbirth as divine punishments, hinder the adaptation of medical advancements like anesthesia? Why did Florence Nightingale's nursing reform face resistance, and how did they reform healthcare as a profession for women? How did the romanticisation of death, for example, in literature and art, shape social attitudes towards diseases like tuberculosis? Why were harmful treatments like bloodletting and mercury still widely used despite evidence of their dangers? How did the development of antiseptic surgery for Joseph Lister transform medical outcomes, and why was it initially rejected by many surgeons? What technical issues arose from non-consensual medical experimentation and marginalised populations, for example, the poor or colonialised peoples? Why was there widespread public distrust on vaccination programmes, and how does this parallel modern debates about immunisation? How did the Medical Act of 1858 professionalise healthcare, and what gaps remained in regulating quackery or unsafe practices? How did industrialisation and urbanisation exacerbate the spread of disease like typhoid or scarlet fever? What role did the Public Health Act of 1875 play in reducing mortality rates, and why did similar reforms take decades to implement? How did colonialism influence the global spread of diseases like cholera, and how were colonial subjects treated differently in medical experiments? In what ways did Victorian public health reforms lay the groundwork for modern epidemiology and disease prevention strategies? Why is the Victorian era often described as a period of both medical progress and profound suffering? Provide specific examples. How might Victorian-era treatments for mental health conditions, for example rescues, asylums, reflect broader social fears about deviance? Compare the Victorian responses to smallpox with modern pandemics such as COVID-19. What similarities or differences exist in public trust and policy? How did the rise of consumer culture in the Victorian era contribute to the popularity of systematic remedies? What lessons can modern healthcare systems learn from the failure and successes of Victorian public health initiatives? If you were a Victorian physician advocating for germ theory, how would your counter arguments favouring miasma theory or humoral balance? Some answers. Question 1. The humoral theory balance of blood Falmer black and yellow bile legs treatments like bloodletting, purging and blistering, offering harm in patients. The miasma theory attributed disease to bad air, prompting sanitation reforms but ignoring pathogens. Limitations included no understanding of germ inactiveness or dangerous practices. Question 2. Cholera thrived in overcrowded, unsanctuary cities with contaminated water. John Snow's 1854 Broad Street pump study linked cholera to waterborne transmissions, challenging miasma theory by proving a specific source rather than bad air. Question 3. Wealthy individuals access private physicians insurance, while the poor relied on patent medicines and workhouse infirmaries with higher mortality rates. For example, smallpox vaccination rates lagged among the poor, leading to a total of 23,000 deaths in the 1871 epidemic. TB was romanticised. Question 4. TB was romanticised as a poetic disease linked to creativity, for example, John Keats. This marks its reality as a poverty-driven killer prevalent in overcrowded slums where malnutrition and poor ventilation fueled its spread. Germ theory. Question 5. The 1847 hand washing protocol reduced childbed fever mortality, but doctors resisted the idea they transmitted pathogens. Lack of germ theory understanding delayed acceptance, causing preventable deaths. Question 6. Childbed fever was blamed on women's weakness, but unhygienic doctors had scarier treatments like rescuers, e.g. Charlotte Perkins Gilmore, reinforced stereotypes of female fragility. Question 7. Patient medicine, e.g., for example, Linda Pinkham's tonic with 20% alcohol, offered accessible marketed hope. Distrust in formal medicine arose from harmful practices like mercury use and class-based inaccessibility. Question 8. Some clergy opposed asphyxia in childbirth, citing Genesis chapter 3, verses 16, pain in childbirth. This delayed pain relief adoption despite evidence of safety. Question 9. Nightingale professionalised nursing through training and hygiene standards. For example, Crimean War resistance came from male doctors dismissing women's roles, but her work elevating nursing to a respected profession. Question 10. TB's portrayal in art and literature, for example, operatic heroism, suffering, diverting attention from public health failures and poverty, driving the academic. Question 11. Bloodletting and mercury persisted due to tradition and lack of alternatives. Medical training rooted in homotheoric load change, even as evidence of harm mounted. 12. Joseph Lister's carbolic acid reduced surgical infections from 50 to 15%, but surgeons rejected it as a cumbersome germ theory's gradual acceptance validating his methods post-1870s. 13. Marginalised group, poor colonialised people face non-consensual trials. Colonial subjects were exploited for vaccine research, reflecting racism and power imbalances. 14. Anti-vaccine leagues citing religious and safety concerns, similar to modern anti-vax movements. Misinformation and distrust of authorities fueled resistance. 15. The Act sterilised qualifications and standardised qualifications and marginalised cracks, but failed to regulate patent medicines. Class-based access persisted, leaving the poor vulnerable. 16. Urbanization without infrastructure caused overcrowding and contaminated water, exuberating cholera and TB. Factories' poor conditions led to occupational diseases like phossy. 17. Mandated sanitation, clean water and slum cleanliness reducing waterborne diseases. Life expectancy in London rose from 37 in 1841 to 45 in 1901, though rural areas lagged. 18. Colonial trade routes spread cholera globally. British doctors tested treatments on colonialised populations, exploiting them while ignoring local healthcare needs. 19. John Snow's mapping and sanitation reforms laid groundwork for disease tracking and prevention. Public health campaigns framed hygiene as a civic duty, influencing modern policies. 20. Breakthrough germ theory aesthetics coexisted with high morality. And here are some rhetorical questions, and then I'll provide some insights. Question 1. How could a society that prided itself on industrial and imperial progress cling to medical practices as bloodletting while standing on the brink of revolutionary discoveries like germ theory. Tim, what does it say? What does it say about Victorian mortality that diseases like tuberculosis were romanticised in art, yet the victims, often the poor, were left to die in overcrowded slums? 3. Can we truly call it progress when life-saving vaccines existed but were denied to the poor due to the cost, prejudice or distrust? 4. How many lives might have been saved if doctors had washed their hands before childbirth rather than dismissing the thought of hand washing to their professional pride? 5. Why did a society obsessed with cleanliness and prosperity resist the very reforms, sanitation, clean water, hygiene that would have saved countless children from scarlet fever or cholera? 6. What does the Victorian-era glorification of suffering, such as opposing asphyxia for women in labour, reveal about its perception of human dignity? 7. How could mercury-laced camomile still be prescribed as a cure when its effects, rotting gums, organ failure, were as visible as the disease it claimed to treat? 8. If germ theory was proven in the 1860s, why did my miasma shadow linger for decades, condemning thousands to preventable deaths? 9. How many working class lives were sacrificed in the name of medical intervention as cracks peddled opium tonics and surgeons experimented without consent? 10. Can a disease ever be just a disease, or does a society always layer it with meaning, whether it's divine punishment, moral failing, or poetic fate? Here are some insights. Well, Victorian society prized innovation in industry and empire, but resisting medical reform due to deep-rooted traditions in institutionalised interior. The medical establishment, steeped in centuries-old practices like humour theory, viewed new ideas as threats to their authority. Germ theory's abstract nature, invisible pathogens, clashed with the tangible logic of miasma, delaying acceptance. Progress was selective, prioritising railroads over healthcare for the marginalised. 2. The romanticisation of TB is a beautiful death for artists, e.g., for example, Keats and Bronte served as a cultural ethic masking the systematic neglect of the poor. By framing suffering as noble, the elite absorbed themselves with guilt by the urban scholar. Meanwhile, slums lack ventilation and nutrition, making TB a poverty trap. This duality exposed a society that emphasised suffering while denying its victims dignity. 3. Vaccines like Jenner's smallpox cure were hailed as triumphs, but to access was steadfast by class. The poor forced logistical barriers such as cost, distance and misinformation and anti-vaccine propaganda. This mirrors modern healthcare inequalities. Breakthroughs exist, but systematic biases determines who survives. The Victorian-era progress was thus a privilege, not a right. 4. In 1847, hand washing protocol reduced childbed fever deaths by 90%, yet doctors rejected it for decades. Their resistance stemmed from toxic masculinity, missing, they cause deaths by transmitting killer particles would undermine their authority. This tragedy reveals how ego and hierarchy can override evidence even in medicine. 5. Privately, Victorians fantasised clothing as soap white linen, yet publicly they resisted sewage reforms due to cost and class biases. The wealthy saw filth as a moral failing of the poor, not a structural issue. This hypocrisy underscores the social priorities, how social priorities are shaped by power, not logic. 6. Religious arguments against pain relief, for example, Eve's course, framed suffering as a moral purifier for women. This denied female agency and echoed practical control over bodies. Esteemed eventful adaptation driven by Queen Victoria's own use shows how social change often hinges on Elite's approval, not empathy. Common practices 7. Why prescribe common practices reflect medical orientism and the lack of alternatives. Doctors clung to it because it produced dramatic if harmful effects, reinforcing their perceived expertise. Patients desperate for action trusted active treatments over doing nothing. A cautionary tale about the allure of interventionism. 8. Miasma was a comfortable lie. It blamed disease on visible filth, easy to scapegoat the poor rather than invisible germs, requiring systematic change. Accepting germ theory meant overhauling infrastructure and admitting prior failures, a costly reckoning for institutions and politicians. 9. The poor and colonialised were treated as medical raw material. Experiments, for example, testing vaccines, exploited their lack of power to consent. This dehumanisation echoes in modern clinical trials conducted in the Global South programme built on marginalised bodies. 10. Disease in the Victorian era was a canvas for social fears. TB is poetic, syphilis is sinful, cholera is a foreign threat. These narratives distracted from root causes, poverty, inequality, and justified control over undesirable groups. Today, diseases like obesity or COVID-19 still carry moral bagging, proving medicine is never just science, it's culture. Mm. 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 Um, the Victorian era's battle against disease reveals a profound reality. A society teething between enlightenment and ignorance, compassion and cruelty, intervention and interior. Its medical history is not merely a chronicle of archaic practices, but a mirror reflecting timeless truths about human nature, our capacity for both hubris and humanity, exploitation and empathy. Final thoughts. Progress is not linear. The Victorians remind us that scientific advancement often outpaces social acceptance. Germ theory languished for decades, not due to a lack of evidence, but because it threatened entrenched power structures. Progress demands not just discovery, but the courage to dismantle dogma. Health is a social justice issue. The era staggering mortality rates among the poor were not just inevitable, they were the result of indifference. Cholera ravaged slums not because the poor were immoral, but because clean water was a privilege. Today, as we grapple with healthcare inequalities, this lesson remains urgent. Disease thrives where society fails. Ethics must guide intervention, from non-consensual experimentations to mercury poisoning. Victorian medicine warns of the peril of prioritising progress over humanity. Modern medicine, with its AI algorithms and genetic engineering, must heed this caution. Interventions without ethics is exploitation. Disease is never just a disease. Illness is laid with cultural meaning, whether Victorian consumption is poetic fate or modern stigma around mental health. Recognising these narratives allows us to confront biases and treat the whole person, not just malady. Inspirational quotes to carry forward. And I've read this. I have been prosecuted, but let me die knowing that my discovery will save lives. Lessons. Truth often faces resistance. Perseverance is its ally. Dr. Rudolf Vischer, father of social medicine. Medicine is a social science, and politics is nothing but medicine on a grand scale. Lessons. Health cannot be divorced from justice, housing, or equality. Carl Jung. Knowledge rests not upon truth alone, but upon error also. Lesson. The Victorian era's bloodletting miasma teach us as much as their triumphs. Marisol Seacole, Jamaican nurse and unsung Crimean War hero. I trust in God and I don't fear death. Lesson. Resilience and compassion transcended barriers of race, gender and recognition. A call to carry forward. The Victorians left us a legacy, not of answers, but of questions. Who deserves care? Whose voices are silenced? How do we balance tradition with truth? Their stories urges us to confront modern parallels, vaccine hysteria, medical racism, profit-driven healthcare with the same rigour and moral clarity that they lacked. As we navigate the 21st century challenges, let us remember that medicine is more than science. It is a covenant between the powerful and the vulnerable. Carry forward the lessons of this era, not as relics, but as reminders. Question authority, even when cloaked in expertise. See disease through the lens of human dignity, not just data. Build systems that heal, not systems that harm. In the words of poet and physician Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., who witnessed the dawn of germ theory. The world's great men have not commonly been great scholars, but great doers. May we be doers who learn from the past to heal the future. Final line. History is not a burden on the memory, but illumination of the soul. Lord acting, let us illuminate our path forward. And that, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, concludes today's lesson on Victorian medicine. Thank you for joining me today at the Butterfly Princess Academy, and thank you for listening to my lecture on Victorian medicine and Victorian-era illnesses and how they were treated. That's all for today. I'm going to sign off now. Thank you again for joining me, and I very much hope you can join me very soon for the next lesson of the at the Butterfly Princess Academy, where curiosity takes flight and wisdom wears wings. Thank you very much, and I will see you all again very soon. Bye for now.